this kind of massive changes you're referring to, usually those only happen after great wars. Some exceptions, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, then the international system changed fundamentally. But if we do see a massive
Or the collapse of the American empire.
collapse of the American empire, yeah, that would that would make that would make one of these crises. But I was going to say before, there's been these reports now that that from the Trump administration, there are some that now favoring replacing the G7 with what they call the Core Five or the C5, which would be the US, China, Russia, India, and Japan. Again, now, as for grand strategy, I think, it's in the right direction because, the key institutions have to reflect the existing distribution of power. Um, but Europe's not, no European countries are on that list, of course, and besides for Russia. But it does beg the question, though, what do you see in this new shift? Because obviously economic hardship will now force changes upon the United States, and we already seen the new national security strategy begin to pivot away from the past. That is, no hard words about Russia. Meanwhile, there's almost plans for coups in Ukraine, sorry, in Europe, or at least cultivate opposition. It's that. So things are changing. But what do you see the role of Europe in this new world, which the U.S. have to adjust to?
Well, that 5 is already flawed, and it's flawed because Donald Trump doesn't like Lula da Silva in Brazil. Brazil ought to be in there. And by the way, in our little group, to start this off in the consortium, Brazil was there. And that was 2 decades and a half ago. I think you have to put them there. Population-wise, resource-wise, potential for enormous damage to the climate if you don't control it right, rainforests and such. And we also, I was trying to think of the other country we had in there. We had another country in there now. Well, no, that was Indonesia, simply because of what we were doing at the particular time. Anyway, I think it needs to be a little bit bigger, and it needs to have countries in there who are struggling to a certain extent, and not just the chieftains. I
I do
would say the
think.
same thing about this. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say Indonesia. I think that's one of the most underestimated countries there are in terms of the direction of this country. This is going to be a massive player in the future, and it doesn't pop up on the radar, at least here in Europe, which is kind of
No.
strange because it is of immense importance, especially as a fellow maritime power.
Of all people, for me to quote, and I can't remember the exact words, but one of our ambassadors, when I was a lieutenant colonel and executive assistant to one of the Navy admirals at the U.S. Pacific Command at that time, was in Jakarta. And he made a statement just like the one you just made. This was 1985. He made a statement about we needed to pay attention to Indonesia. We needed to pay attention to what potential was there and so forth. Anyway, that's typical ambassador, you'd say, but no, we even thought in J5 in Pacific Command, the strategic and policy part of Pacific Command, that he was right. His name was Paul D. Wolfowitz. And of the 35 ambassadors in the Pacific Theater that we sort of managed, and that's the way the United States looked at it, we managed them, they didn't manage us. He was probably one of the better ambassadors, and we had some good ones. We had a lot of good ambassadors during those years. But got off subject there. Basically, you need a better representation of the planet, and one that doesn't reflect post-World War II realities because they're gone. As the Europeans in spades are demonstrating to us, not in a positive way, in a negative way. They don't understand. They don't understand what the war meant. They don't understand what the war delivered them. They don't understand the years of peace and joy and great social programs and such that delivered them. It's over. It's done, and you need some replacement, and you need to step into the replacement with as much candor, honesty, straightforward looking, and competence as you can muster. Because if you don't, you're not going to make it work right, and you're going to fall into what always happens when that occurs, internecine squabbling and war, ultimately. I mean, that's still a prospect. It's still a prospect, no matter how much we try to salvage what remains of the empire. And China participates in that with Russia alongside and India as a partner and the rest. No matter how much we do that is positive, smart, strategic, capable, it could still fall apart in a heartbeat, and we wind up with 75 years of internecine warfare across the face of the planet that might even be nuclear in some places. All at the same time that we reach the end of the 21st century and 99% of the world says, hey, those guys were right about climate change.
What is interesting though is when you speak to, well, different academics or officials in from Beijing or from China in general, they make this point that in the past the Europe had such a high standing in their foreign ambitions in terms of who they wanted to partner up and work with, but these days the Europeans are just, well, they they walked away from this completely. They don't see that much value as they did in the past. But also the United States and Russia, they also share this idea that they both want to pivot away from Europe now. So it does appear that this continent is, yeah, going to will go through a lot of hardship. I don't think it has dawned on these leaders. Of course, we're not blessed with the best of leaders here, um, but I want to just.
It'd be really, I just think it'd be impossible to pivot away from what are we looking at now about if we don't even count Ukraine or some of the other countries that we seem to want to count now. What are we looking at? About 400 million people that had a GDP last year of somewhere around the equivalent of ours, 22, $23 trillion. That's falling apart now, of course, but we can't deny that vast array of heretofore very troublesome groups. I mean, the whole history of Europe is a history of war.
Well, I think we're going back to that. The time of a cohesive Europe as one entity. I think that was an unusual part of the history, and it's also coming to an end. I think you already see the internal fragmentation of Europe. So again, to what extent do you want to keep it united at the expense of national interests and the dependence on Russian boogeyman in order to keep the whole thing together? I think it will begin to split, especially as the economic hardship sets in. Um, but as a last question, though, how do you see? Because you mentioned the economic crisis, which is about to sweep the U.S. and maybe, wash away the empire. How do you see this playing out? Is this in the near future? You think that this $3 trillion will begin to really create some massive problems?
I think it's much closer than I thought it was, Glenn. Much closer. I wasn't even sure. I'm 81 in January, and I wasn't sure, not sure I wanted to. I was going to live to see the real black and white demise of the American empire. I think I might. I think I might. And it's going to be started, and the unraveling will become apparent to every citizen from west to east, north to south, because of the physical crisis. It's almost to the point where you have to say everything's going to come crashing down, from the housing market to the stock market, which is so inflated. It's just pitiful right now, to interest rates climbing through the sky, to a barrel of oil quadrupling in price in terms of what you can pay for it and do with it. We're going to have to change a lot of the way we live in this country. We've been very hedonistic. We've been very sloppy, selfish, all across the country. I can't pick a single state out to tell you that doesn't, the majority of the people don't meet that description. There's some that are worse than others, of course, and some that consequently are better, but not any of them are right where they should be. They're even reasonably right where they should be. So Americans are going to have to hitch up their pants and take a real beating. And they're not used to that. They haven't done that in ages and ages, generations. They haven't done that. They're going to have to. They talk about the oil crisis in the 70s when you had to stop and get in a line for gas. Oh, that was terrible. Those damn Arabs and all that. They did that to us. Or you talk about the hostages in Iran for 444. Those are tempests in a teapot. They're going to have something the equivalent of the Civil War to live through it. Only that's not even a good metaphor or example, because west of the Mississippi, the war almost didn't touch. And even east of the Mississippi, it didn't touch a lot. It touched specific areas really dramatically, and casualties were high, and put brother against sister and so forth. But that's the only thing I could compare even remotely in our history as a nation with what's coming. Certainly wouldn't compare World War II or World War I. They were insignificant to America in the sense of what is coming now. So that's going to be a big test of the American people.
Well, when Obama took over, when you were in the White House, I think the debt was at 9 trillion, and now, of course, it's 38, soon to go into 39. It's going to be, the way the can has been kicked down the road, it's going to be a very difficult time ahead, and I think most of the world is exposed in a very big way, or all of the world. So
Yeah.
it's going to be very troubling. And usually, this kind of crisis, I would like to think it would help to build some character, restore the ability to prioritize, begin again with strategic thinking, all this. But in reality, I do fear that it's going to be war, though, that a few wars at least will start because of this.
And the sad thing, Glenn, about what you say is, if I check my history closely, I would say, okay, let's transport some of that history into the modern age, i.e. present day. Who's going to get that idea first? The Pentagon. Because they're going to see the handwriting on the wall. I got $1 trillion this year. I'm going to get 200 billion next year. Ooh, what can I do to stave that off?
It all reminds me of something that the Senator Rand Paul said once. He said, it's not about keeping the empire knot. It's either we roll back the empire controlled, or we face an uncontrolled collapse.